Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jenna Pilgrim. I am the head of platform at CoinFund, and I am pleased to be moderating this panel today with my esteemed panelists. So we're here to talk about multi-chain DeFi, liquidity, access, and economic design. So we'll unpack all of that if you're not familiar. With me, I am happy to have, Tomer from Stellar, Jack from Berachain, David from Polygon, and Tanmay from Chain. So if we could actually just go down the line, could you guys, just for the audience, if they're not familiar with your project, I know a lot of you are a little bit famous, so people may be familiar, but if you could give us a little bit of an overview of kind of what your project is and sort of your approach to DeFi.
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Tomer from the Stellar Development Foundation. Been with Stellar since 2017. Stellar has been around since 2014, so it's been a while. Really focused on financial inclusion, equitable access. We're actually pretty new to the DeFi game. So Stellar started as a very simple chain. Last year, we've added smart contract capabilities with a WebAssembly runtime. And so there's a growing DeFi ecosystem, but essentially still really focused on kind of like the equitable access piece of it.
Awesome. Jack?
Hey everyone, I'm Jack from Berachain. Berachain is a L1 that is utilizing a mechanism called proof of liquidity, which in short is kind of the chain level view of a fat application thesis, where by default a lot of value goes to applications and users as the primary end goal, and then to validators and stakers second, kind of derivative of the first. So big DeFi scene, big consumer app scene, and talk more about it later.
Hey, I'm David from Polygon. Polygon is an Ethereum scaling solutions company, primarily known for Polygon POS, a L2 that has the most stable coin velocity of any chain. Additionally, work with a number of chains utilizing our AG layer and CDK frameworks, helping them grow their DeFi ecosystem, consumer ecosystem, and whatever they need to tick.
Hi guys, I'm Tanmay from Chain. I do protocol, and Chain is a omni-chain protocol system where we write the protocol out for helping developers develop these omni-chain D-apps, which are connected across multiple chains so that they can access the liquidity across all of these chains. Yeah, that's basically what we do.
Awesome, thank you. So obviously, you guys play each sort of different roles in the L1 stack, from cross-chain protocols to access layers to really true L1s. How do you approach, and this probably should go to Jack, how do you guys approach sort of the growth of DeFi in a new ecosystem? So Berachain obviously just came out in the last little while. How do you really bootstrap that kind of access to DeFi for your users?
Yeah, that's a good question. So DeFi at its core is effectively only three things. Really, really straightforward, right? At the most basic level, you have liquidity. That can be passive liquidity, active liquidity, AMMs, order books, whatever you want to kind of structure that as. But that's really the base level, because in almost every way, the capacity that you have for liquidity on your network and the assets that you have liquid on your network are going to constrain everything that sits above it in the stack. The second level are lending products, so think like traditional money markets, CDPs, anything that really allows someone to take an asset that has liquidity as collateral and then utilize it productively by borrowing it against it. That also has the benefit of creating rates that you can use in your ecosystem more broadly for things like that sit on the third level, which are like vault type products, structured rate products, think like Pendle, anything with yield splitting, as well as user abstracted products like stablecoins that have built-in yield, et cetera. Also in that level are things like derivative products, perps, like more generalized derivatives like 0 days, et cetera. And the reason you kind of stack it like that is because everything ends up being generally a factor of the liquidity in the layer previous to it. And then for Berachain specifically, I think we take a viewpoint that I think is becoming increasingly common, which is that on the one hand, you have to have some really interesting applications that users want to go to, visit front ends, interact with directly. And that's awesome. That's really catering to the demographic that exists on chain today. It brings liquidity on the user base that's on chain today. But I think increasingly we also have this point of view that DeFi over the medium to long term, in the same way that you're not going to like NewYorkStockExchange.com every time you want to place an order for your stocks, will increasingly become abstracted behind applications that are directly targeted to go to consumers, think like fintechs. And so having both the on-chain demographic, front-end visiting, crypto natives today, but then also building these abstraction products that'll utilize them in the back end, almost like a brokerage.
Yeah, I just want to add on that. I think the last thing that Jack touched on, which is this access piece and kind of like growing the pie. I think too often in our ecosystem, we talk about kind of like the nuances of DeFi, and it's all kind of like redistributing the existing pie. But at the end of the day, if we really want this ecosystem to mature, to grow, and to bring more people, then we need to kind of like abstract away DeFi. We need to turn these services into something that you can incorporate in your fintech app, something that presents itself to the user not as a DeFi instrument, but more as like a savings vehicle with a set of risks that are acknowledged, and something that also is easy to access. And I think access is kind of like a really big thing that is missing. It's something that Stellar has been working on since for the past decade, which is we have this interoperable networks of on and off ramps. We call these the anchor network. And anchors basically facilitate on and off ramps that you have a lot around the world. One of the biggest ones is MoneyGram. So you can actually walk into any MoneyGram agent around the world. That's more than 400,000 agents, and turn your Stellar USDC, the cash in your hand, or the other direction. And it helps create this very seamless cash to DeFi experience where if I have a Stellar wallet, I can bring cash into it, and I can immediately put that into a DeFi protocol. A lot of times these are more kind of like conservative DeFi protocols. Maybe it's stable bonds, things that have like sustainable yield, less adventurous, but more appealing to the mass consumer.
Well, and I think you'll get that diversity of usership there, right? You have your retail users, you have your institutional users who may be accustomed to, Jack, to your point about more of like a vault-like product. Tanmay, I want to ask you about, because you're an access protocol to access a bunch of different L1s. And so when you look at the L1s that we have here, how do you sort of approach that multi-chain thesis when you're assessing who to build integrations for?
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to add to what Jack said earlier around liquidity. So liquidity is really the main cornerstone for DeFi. And at ZeraChain, we look at liquidity in a slightly different way. Since ZeraChain is connected to all of these different chains, so we look at liquidity as like a unified concept across all of these chains. When you build a universal application on ZeraChain, you get to access the liquidity from all of these connected chains, and it flows freely without any sort of like clunky bridges or like any sort of like locking and unlocking. It really removes those security barriers. So it sort of brings in this abstraction level, which as a developer, you can sort of start building these, like, I would say intent-based applications where you decide like, you have like a cross-chain lending app, right? Or you decide like you want to borrow on this chain or you want to lend on this chain. You can just write the logic behind it, and the protocol sort of takes care of whatever happens beneath it. It's like when you book an Uber, right? You decide the destination and how the app routes your car and who the driver is. That's decided by the app. That's what ZeraChain does, really. Yeah.
So I think that that truly multi-chain approach is one that, going forward, do you think that's one that will scale to all of the different L1s that exist? Do you think, I guess this is a question for our whole panel, do you think there is a world where all blockchains are truly interoperable?
I think we're heading in that direction for sure. Ultimately, I think it's going to cause two end results. One is users want to go where applications are, and generally, within the context of DeFi, that's yields and that's depth of liquidity. Not all chains are going to be that winning thing. Ultimately, Polygon definitely, when we work with all the chains, we we work in support with, we have the strong held belief that chains need to specialize. There needs to be a distinct purpose for what you are as a chain, that generalized block space is becoming a commodity and is going to be a race to zero. But specialized block space is where we need to see things going forward. There's going to be a small number of DeFi chains. There's going to be a small number of RWA or payments chains. There will be a number of NFT chains, but the general purpose chain of I can just launch an L2 is kind of dying. And so, yes, we will see interoperability, but less so of I'm trying to touch everywhere versus I'm an application builder and I'm going to pick specific applications across a certain subset of networks to build the best end user experience.
Can I slightly push back on this idea of like app chains in general? I think that this is a recurring meta in the extent that for the past decade we've gone through this like cycles of multi-purpose chains going back to app chains and so on and so forth. And I think that every time there's like a new meta, and sometimes it's like supply chains, and sometimes it's gaming and all these things. At the end of the day, we keep coming back to tokens, RWAs, DeFi, and it's like, are we actually like what are these specialized chains? Are we gonna wake up tomorrow morning? There's gonna be like this new use case that no one has thought about.
I don't think it's necessarily a new use case that people haven't thought about, but I can look at like examples that we see today. We've seen a proliferation of chains trying unique theses. So just looking on top of base different L3s, you have Blackbird that's doing restaurant reservations and points on its own isolated ecosystem, where it's probably a better fit there where they can do various things like application-specific sequencing and other features that help them succeed. On Polygon alone, I can say that like there's a lot of capacity for payments. Probably makes sense for Polymarket at some point to be its own chain. There's a tremendous amount of transactions, and they don't need to be in a generalized block space where they can get their own capacity. I would say that if blockchains had unlimited capacity, then yes, we could have this generalized purpose thesis, but ultimately people are going to want to customize. We have more tools than ever to allow that to be accomplished.
But I think from
from
an application perspective,
Yeah.
you build like companies like Blackbird, to use your example, they built an application for restaurants. At the end of the day, if they want to be able to raise more money or they want to be able to get access to more new communities, they're either going to need to pick an L1 and get access from there, or they're going to need to build their own blockchain. And then at some point, we saw this happen with Pudgy Penguins now launching Abstract. Abstract is a general purpose blockchain, and they're a penguin company. Like,
I would say Abstract might be general purpose in terms of like its stock EVM, but they're very much taking a consumer focused tilt as to what they're incentivizing on it.
Tomer, did you want to add something there?
No.
Yeah, I mean, I want to look at liquidity and the applications itself as like two different things. So right now, when we consider like these interoperable blockchains, we are looking at these chains which are doing these specific things, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Like you could have liquidity concentrated on one chain. It's like lately, Bitcoin is turning out to be like an anchor peg where you get all of these liquidity locked in Bitcoin, but then you can then use the Bitcoin or the wrap tokens in other DeFi applications and access the DeFi existing on Ethereum on like different chains. So, yeah.
So I want to double tap on that for a second. You're talking about wrap tokens, about sort of how you retain users. Do we think that this just becomes an incentive game? Is it just an incentive competition as to who can pay developers to build on their chain more so? Or how much of it is attributed to economic design versus marketing?
I don't necessarily feel that it's an incentive game, because when you are transferring liquidity across these different chains, the users are really free to move around and figure out like which chain works the best for them. Even for the developers, like whichever chain works best for them, they just don't have to worry about where the liquidity is coming from.
Anyone else want to take on incentives versus economic design versus marketing?
Yeah, look, the incentive game is a terrible game, and I wish our ecosystem would stop playing it in general. It's also definitely a kind of like a reshuffling the current pie, not growing the pie game. At the end of the day, I do think that when we'll see real adoption coming in with these type of kind of like use case wallets in specific areas that give users access to financial services that they don't have access to. If you're a developer of a wallet like that, you can't play the incentives game. You need to put your users towards, a sustainable source of yield, something that, doesn't require them to, frantically jump around between incentive games?
I think there's like a clear delineation here that doesn't actually exist, right? Like everyone's like incentive games or economics or marketing or any of these other things, right? Like Berachain doesn't really do grants, but that doesn't mean that there aren't incentives, right? Any good economic mechanism in DeFi and crypto broadly can create incentives from the mechanism design itself, right? Like the super simple example of that probably almost everyone in this room is familiar with is like Athena, right? You separate out roles and responsibilities for the protocol into a stable coin and into a yield-bearing stable, such that the total supply is earning yield, but only some portion of the users actually have claims to that yield. And in doing so, you're creating an incentive, right, in the form of encouraging people to hold the stable that doesn't have claim, that doesn't have seigniorage, and in doing so, are able to bootstrap growth more effectively on the yield-bearing side because of that splitting. That is an incentive, right? It's not giving incentives in the form of I'm paying someone $2 million to come build on my chain, right? I think yes, that's probably bad. I think we can agree on that, right? But at the same time, there's clear things that you can do from a design POV, from a GTM POV, and from a user acquisition POV, right? Like I remember years ago, I read this Matt Levine piece where he was joking that like if you order Uber Eats in Mexico, you're getting subsidized by the crown prince of the UAE, right? Because in some capacity, venture is willing to underwrite subsidization in the early days for growth to discover if something has product market fit. Crypto should not be different, but the benefit is that we can get very creative in the way that our protocols are structured relative to traditional equity companies to really create incentives in a unique way. In some capacity, that's like really what Berachain is about at its core. And so for us, that's always the major area of focus. And then you combine that with perhaps you might want to call it marketing. I don't think we think of ourselves as big marketers, but definitely big culture, right? In terms of trying to onboard people that feel and think similarly such that there's an environment where people can combine and create mechanisms in novel ways to create new incentives.
So do you see that more, I just want to double tap on that. Do you see that more as like community driven growth? Or do you, sometimes marketing can be a scary word, so we could replace it with the word growth because that's the same. And I agree, working at a VC, we do underwrite a certain amount of risk for, or not risk, but a certain amount of funds to be allocated to like, this is what we need to grow the network. And we're fine with the network not making a lot of money for the first couple of years. So I want to send this to either Polygon or Stellar, you guys can pick. But once you get out of that kind of honeymoon period of an L1, how do you make sure that those users stay? Or that those, like once the incentive mechanisms are different, they could be incentive design, they could be ingrained design, they could be, they could be built by the foundation, they could be supplemented by the foundation. How do you really retain that sort of user growth?
I think it comes in a few places. So I like what you said about, incentives need to kind of stop. I think when we talk about incentives versus more growth, it's the mercenary capital attraction where we're not growing the pie and we're all trying to get the same 5 LPs. I think, for Polygon, a lot of focus, especially when we're working with these other chains, is finding capital that's going to be sticky, finding capital that's novel and net new for the ecosystem, and really trying to find things that are sticky and attractive. I would rather take a $5 to $10 million LP that's not moving than a $100 million LP that's going to be leaving after 6 months my incentive program ends. And so I look at that with deals we've done like Lemon Cash out of Argentina that has an earn product that's based on Polygon POS. Selected because we had the on-ramps, selected because it was just an easy way for them to take USDC and park it and offer users in Argentina the ability to have access to a yield-bearing product. It's boring, it's not sexy, it doesn't come up on a lot of Dune charts because it's capital just sitting inside of a lending market. It's smaller compared to most whales, but that's capital I don't really have to incentivize outside the initial integration. And along with a lot of the other deals that we tend to do, it's what is permanent transaction volume, what's permanent capital, as opposed to what's a splashy headline figure attracting, crypto natives. There's a place for that, but it's not the entire place.
Yeah, I think there's a well-known concept in tech that is a bit lost in the crypto ecosystem. It's called product market fit.
What?
Yes. Let me tell you about this. You actually have to deliver value to your users. And so I think that a lot of times in crypto, we tend to focus on these like sexy engineering and product questions around, We love to talk about security, about scalability, about user experience. Just fix user experience and they will come. But no, you actually have to deliver value to your users. And I think that one thing that Stellar has really done well throughout the years is really kind of like stay away from the hype cycle and really focus on what is actually creating sustainable value for users rather than what is currently hip and will bring users right now.
Yeah, definitely. So let's pivot to education for a second. Obviously, we can get really far into liquidity, into access control, into sort of incentive design, and all these complicated parts. But then we also talk about abstracting away complexity for the user. So how do you guys, and this could be to any of you, how do you guys balance sort of being user friendly with being developer friendly? And sort of that developer, like at some point, you do have to get in the weeds and say, this is what the design of my L1 is, and this is where all the uniqueness or differentiation lies. But sometimes you have to get into the nitty gritty to get there. So how do you sort of balance that conversation when you're approached by a new user or a new dev?
So at ZeraChain, we try to balance both because there is a requirement for both sort of incentives. And so in terms of like being developer friendly, we have certain placeholders in place. We started developing something called like the ZeraChain toolkit, which is friendly, like a toolkit which allows developers to have these ready-made functions which they can use as modules to build out these cross-chain dApps. So they can be up and starting in like in the matter of like days or weeks. We also have some token standards which we have laid down for the Omnichain tokens and even for NFTs, which are easy to transport across these connected chains. For non-crypto natives, we have been looking at the UI and the UX a whole lot. Cross-chain in itself is a bit complicated when you look at it because a cross-chain transfer has like 3 different transactions going on. We try to nail down the UI so that it's simpler for the user. They can see like one transaction hash, and then that connects to all of these other things. But some of these things have really helped, especially like the UI aspect on bringing in the new users. That's something that has worked for us.
Sure. Whatever.
Yeah, I would say for us at Polygon, we've kind of split it into 2 different arms. We have our arms that sell pretty directly to end developers, whether that's folks running a blockchain or blockchain developers themselves. And that's product suites that we have, like our chain development kit, CDK, actual like contract level programs like bridge and call, things to assist with cross-chain, pre-deploys for various different ERC20s, ERC721s, et cetera. We also have an entirely different side of our sales engineering team, which is focusing on more complete end-to-end products that we can plug into higher level customers. These are things like Vault Bridge, which allow for chains to have actual revenue streams from day one. These are things like the Internet Savings Account, which is a DeFi abstracted stablecoin account, which is powering the Lemon Cash example that I gave and other fintechs around the world to give them access to stablecoin yield. More and more, we find ourselves shifting towards that second batch of it's really easy to hype up our own tech, as plenty of people have been doing. It's come to the time we have to be a bit more opinionated in building just full stack backend applications that we can hand off to a really great Web2 style growth team to white label, scale, and push out to user distribution.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'll add on that, I don't necessarily think that like it is like this. It's not a dichotomy between like developer experience and user experience, but I do think from a very high level perspective, and it's also different between developers of like different parts of the stack. I think that smart contract developers, which we tend to talk about a lot. I think one thing that we work a lot with them is to understand that they are providing like a protocol and a service, and a lot of times I think historically. There's been a lot of focus on like their own front ends for these DeFi protocols, but the actual protein is in having others integrate with your protocol. So both catering to wallets, both catering to dApp developers, both catering to like other protocols as like building blocks. I think that's pretty big. So put an emphasis on that. So it's less about the UI that you build. It's more about the toolkit that you build. Because at the end of the day, as a protocol, you're a service builder. You're not an app builder. And so getting that mindset, I think, is super important.
I agree with all of this.
So then, so obviously this has introduced a lot of fragmentation, obviously. if we have different chains integrating with one another and not compatible with others. How do you sort of see things playing out over the next, maybe not the next 6 months, but over the next year or 18 months as we, either the market goes up or the market goes down, there still will be consolidation that occurs. So how do you, and I'll actually put this to Jack, how do you see sort of either Bearchain evolving as an ecosystem in the next year to 18 months? And how do you view consolidation or fragmentation?
Yeah, I agree with David's earlier point where he said that chains will have to have some level of specialization that they really focus on to differentiate. And for us, I think a large portion of that is one, in the way that we work with teams. I guess coming back to your last question, there's less of a focus internally of like having a sales team in the traditional sense that many chains do, which is like, let me come pitch you on why you should build with me. And for us, I feel like a lot of the time that we spend with teams is actually really focused on things like GTM, product design, figuring out how to actually approach things from that point of view. Also comes back to the incentives question where, the goal is to self-select into builders that want to be a part of the kind of culture that we built out, but also are looking for a kind of support that is more on the product side. And then specialization at the chain level, which is about like, what can you do differently than other chains? And for us specifically, I think the things that we've realized that we're really good at are one, liquidity acquisition in effective ways from a cost of capital point of view because of the proof of liquidity mechanism. But then also the ability to build something like the chain's core component of proof of liquidity into an application's unit economics, where if we're talking product market fit, and you're able to eke an extra 50% on a relative basis on the revenue that you're taking in effect, that becomes like a really powerful way to fuel either initial growth and help you figure out if you have product market fit more quickly, or alternatively to start taking in a little bit of revenue to sustain the business itself over the long term, and that can be returned to token holders or otherwise. And so from a compression POV, that can be applications that live on Bearchain directly. That can be importing yields that exist on other chains really effectively. And at the chain level, whether it's proliferation of cross-chain token standards like OFT, which we work a lot with, or whether it's chain-level integrations with things like AgLayer for major assets or like Stargate Hydra type solutions, right? There's a bunch of different technology out there. And I'd even argue that from a cross-chain interop POV, you can generally actually underwrite almost any cross-chain application use case today, and I don't think we're quite as far away from that as a lot of people think. And so if you hold that is the case, then what really matters is having a differentiated set of users that want to interact with applications, whether abstracted or directly, that understand the components of what your chain can bring to them for either the core application itself or whatever it is that they're trying to grow and scale.
What is one thing that if you were to go back, like that you put a whole bunch of your sort of multi-chain strategy, everyone has some form of multi-chain strategy. What is one thing that you tried? This could probably go to, again, Polygon or Stellar. What is one thing that you tried that you thought was going to work that didn't work, that caused excessive fragmentation?
I think one of the main things that we didn't do is to acknowledge that cross-chain is going to be such a big space, evolving very fast. And so the last thing you want to do is probably to pick winners. And especially as an L1, I think we want to enable any cross-chain solution out there. Like even if you look at a year ago versus now, cross-chain transfers have migrated from the retail perspective almost entirely to intent-based protocols. And so what users are now expecting are instantaneous cross-chain transfers, things that we wouldn't have actually thought about just a couple of years ago. And so we are collaborating with a lot of cross-chain solutions and bridges. I definitely think that don't choose winners, especially as an L1.
David?
Yeah, I think for us, we invested a lot in trying to make blockchains more deployable very early with earlier tech like Supernets, which was kind of our Gen 1 chain deployment product, when instead I wish we had invested that capital in assisting in making better front-end experiences. Well, I know we finally have EIP 7702 in EVM world, and equivalents are coming across other VMs. I think the lack of well-intentioned and competent front-end developers in the space has been shown for a number of years. It shouldn't have taken 7702 for us to figure out how to get rid of the approval modal. I think instead we could have spent that time building much better wallet experiences and the SDKs to allow for a proper experience. I think we missed 2 attempts at mass adoption, and I'm really hoping we get a shot at a third.
Awesome. And I want to make sure we have some time for our hot takes. So each of the panelists were warned in advance that I was going to ask them for a hot take. So we're going to go down the line. We're going to start with Tomar. Give us a hot take right into the camera. What do you think is your hot take on multi-chain DeFi?
Sure. My hot take this week, as it has been every week for the past 8 years, is that blockchain and DeFi are about equitable access and inclusion and democratizing financial access. Everything else is a distraction.
Okay.
Okay, I got out of here last minute, so I didn't know I'd have to be doing a hot take. My hot take first is I don't think that's a hot take. My hot take second is I think that a lot of the things that we hear talked about, like intent-based bridges, all these things are great, right? But heralding them as the be-all, end-all of cross-chain solutions is just like strictly wrong. Like your intent-based platforms, while they can optimize UX in the actual operational phase, are always going to be fundamentally a factor of the liquidity that you have in more traditional bridging solutions, as that's what actually determines the risk that the solver is taking on the intent-based side. And so intent-based solutions are great from a user-facing POV for those that are willing to take a little bit of higher fees, but at the end of the day, you really do still need traditional bridging solutions that handle cross-chain interop natively, like Layer 0 for OFTs, like Ag Layer for L2s and L1s now, and yeah.
I think my DeFi-related hot take is that yield-bearing assets, if that yield is not coming from your ecosystem, can not be great for your chain. Ultimately, like if someone's earning yield and it's not coming from your chain's GDP, someone else is setting your rates, and it can hinder your growth.
My hot take is that the future of decentralized finance is centralized. What I mean by that is there needs to be a collaboration between the centralized and the decentralized aspects of finance so that we have a future where we get all of the huge liquidity that the centralized finance has to offer with the added benefits of DeFi, and the coexistence of those would be ideal for all of us.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. I'll thank my panelists. Let's thank the panelists. And that's a wrap for us.